We're here again, Mario. I had asked you if you had ever met anyone who had been affected by an act of black magic.
Absolutely, myself.
Sparks that I don't remember. Hold and let it shine. Fixing stars to fade away. Fixing stars to fade away. Fixing stars to fade away.
Hello, dear friends of Kabbalah Podcast. We are once again with our friend Mario Sabán and ready to explore new insights.
How are you, Nacho? A pleasure as always, and well, glad to be here again.
Welcome, my pleasure. I am also very happy, and today we are going to deal with a very exciting and intriguing topic, one that challenges our perception and invites deeper reflection. Today we are going to talk about black magic. And please, what I'm going to ask you is to give a brief introduction about the energies that move within this area, so we can better understand their influence.
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that all of this begins, of course, with a soul that is out of balance, a soul that in some way uses psychic resources and all kinds of spiritual resources to harm other people. Ultimately, in Kabbalah, we often speak of white magic in the sense that what we seek is the person's teshuvah, the raising of their level of consciousness. The topic we are dealing with here stands at the opposite extreme of that. It is at the antipodes, because everything Kabbalah proposes has to do with inner peace and the expansion of consciousness. However, it is clear that negative energies do exist, energies that arise from imbalance, from people who are ultimately out of balance, who take on that imbalanced state as part of their identity, and who, of course, can generate imbalance in the external world. In other words, someone who is imbalanced and who embraces that imbalance as their identity, someone who chooses not to pursue Tikun, not rectification, not teshuvah, but instead places themselves, so to speak, in the service of that imbalance, of that harm. A person may begin with small imbalances, for example, a minor envy they cannot control, which then grows stronger over the years. This type of person can eventually reach what we call black magic, which is nothing more than forces that are not negative in and of themselves, but rather misaligned. They are positioned in a way that becomes negative. At its core, this is a path away from consciousness and toward deeper imbalance. With a person who has a negative intentionality and who becomes undoubtedly very dangerous, because not only does the person fail to engage in tikkun, but they also clearly affect their surroundings. Now here there are two aspects to consider: the person who carries out this kind of work, this kind of activity, and what happens to the person who is affected by it, because here we are really dealing with two issues. In truth, both are affected. Of course, the person who does this is affected by their own imbalance, and they also destabilize their environment or another individual. We know that within the overall divine plan, imbalances, as Luzzatto, the great Italian Kabbalist, tells us, are ultimately connected to a positive purpose in the long term. From the Kabbalistic point of view, we understand that incorrect forces or negative forces, I'll use the Hebrew term so people can understand the technical expression, sitra akra. Sitra akra means the other side or the left side. Later we could explain why. In Kabbalah, it is referred to as the left side or the dark side. Sitra akra is that side we call the left, and therefore sinister, because it comes from the left hand, the sinistra, as opposed to the right hand, the dextera. So when we say something is sinister, it comes from the left. And what happens there? What takes place on that side? Energies become positioned in a distorted way. We start from the premise that energies can be properly aligned, mid-dot, the virtues, or distorted energies, which are Klipot. Now, one thing is a distortion that a person is actively working to correct, because they know that distortion is negative. And another very different thing is when a person is, in some way, aware of the distortion, and yet operates within it as if it were normal. When they normalize the klipa, they normalize the distortion. Someone who normalizes distortion finds themselves in what, in the first century, would have been called being possessed. In other words, they reach a level of imbalance so great that it affects their entire personality. So when we speak of black magic, what are we referring to? We are referring to people who possess the same energies as all of us, with the difference that they place all of that energy in a negative direction. They envy their brother, they hate their cousin, they are imbalanced, and sometimes if they also have mediumistic or psychic abilities, the situation is even worse, because that mediumistic power, that gift or grace, is then used for purposes that are destructive.
Yes, that's it, in a wrong manner.
Yes, in an incorrect way. Now I return to Lusato, because Lusato says that this evil that operates, in this case, we are speaking of black magic, this evil that operates is part of the system until the messianic era arrives, when evil is finally defeated. In other words, these types of imbalanced individuals who cause imbalance in others are, in a sense, a necessary part of humanity's growth. Humanity, as it were, cannot grow and cannot arrive at Tikun Olam without the existence of these counterforces of the Sitra Akra, the dark side or the left side. Therefore, from a general cosmic plan, they are necessary, and from an individual perspective, they are painful, because, of course, they affect you. And if you are very sensitive, sensitive people not only feel these kinds of negative energies, but they may even come to know who is sending them. In other words, there are two levels here. There are people who, at a certain point, for example, in my case, I felt that I was receiving some kind of negative force.
Mm-hmm.
And there came a point when I already knew who was sending that negative force. It's a curious case because you can feel that a negative force is coming from someone you haven't seen in years. So there are different levels of sensitivity. Surely, if there are people listening to us who are mediums and who have this capacity, a medium can feel this negative energy and probably know where it is coming from. So what do many mediums do? They help detect who has carried out a kind of work, let's say black magic, in the sense of helping to identify where that distorted energy originates. The line between helping someone in a correct way or an incorrect way is a very difficult one. In Kabbalah, it must always be for the sake of construction, for correction. But in some esoteric groups, this is not always clear, and it can happen that many people cross to the other side, especially if the person who is helping also has an inner imbalance. In other words, the one who helps must be deeply rooted in inner peace and in a state of balance. Otherwise, the imbalances of the other person can affect you to such an extent that they drag you down. If you have a very weak personality and the other person comes with a strong imbalance, instead of you correcting it, you can be pulled into the other's imbalance because your psyche is not in the right position. Helping another person, from the point of view of Kabbalah, is therefore not simply a matter of technique or technical skill, but of your psychic focus, of knowing clearly where you are heading, where you are placing your focus, so that the other person can accompany you, and so that you can accompany the other in that process of focus.
I would like to make several points about everything that has been said so far. First, I want to draw a distinction between those people who harbor certain negative inner feelings, such as envy, resentment, and similar emotions, and those who, in some way, build an identity based on that distortion, on that negative distortion, to the point of being capable of carrying out actions directly linked to it. I would also like to draw a connection between the negative energy you are talking about and the fact that it manifests not only through actions, but also, and very importantly, through words, through language, as a vehicle for the projection of that energy. This brings to mind the relationship between Balaam and Bilam as an expression of this intentionality to cause harm. Finally, I wanted to mention that in the Talmud, this kind of affliction that a person may project onto you only affects you, according to what the Talmud teaches, if you give it attention, if you engage with it or grant it significance. In other words, what is not received cannot truly take hold. Consciousness determines what takes hold.
I agree with the Talmud, that is, if you are obsessed with this, it will affect you, but if you are not obsessed, it can also affect you. And here we enter into Kabbalah. I mean, the Talmud on one level is right.
Yes.
If you are obsessed, this negative energy enters, but the Kabbalah has another level which is deeper, and it is if you have an imbalance and you, even if you are not obsessed, black magic enters into that imbalance, leverages it, and amplifies it. That is to say, black magic works amplifying a negative reality that you have. But it is a reality that you can work on, and that represents about 10% of your personality. What black magic does is to expand that, almost to project a klipa on a large scale, so that you feel deeply distorted. It amplifies the negative aspect and throws you off balance. In other words, there is a transgression, there is an imbalance, and while Kabbalah works on that imbalance in order to close it and correct it, black magic tries to do the opposite. It tries to open it further. It always opens it on a real point, on something that already exists.
Well, but that's where the function you were talking about is revealed, isn't it?
Of course. What happens there is that not only the function is revealed, but also two issues that need to be addressed. The first is the imbalance itself. A person already has it, because if they didn't, this energy wouldn't be able to enter. That's precisely why negative energy can take hold. The second issue is helping people understand, and for me this is the key point of Tikun, that this imbalance is not as great as the person believes it to be. Because when imbalance becomes amplified, when black magic magnifies it, the operational strategy at work is to make you feel powerless, to make you feel incapable of correcting it. In other words, the goal of black magic is to make you feel that you cannot deal with what is throwing you out of balance. The goal of Kabbalah is exactly the opposite, to make you understand that you can correct it. So yes, they stand at opposite extremes. But when someone has exaggerated or overinflated this imbalance for you, you can end up experiencing that sense of impotence in a very real, lived way, as you said. And there can be another phase that is even worse, one that would represent in this case the triumph of black magic. That phase is when you not only feel powerless in the face of an amplified imbalance, but you also begin to identify yourself with that imbalance. For example, when a person says, "I am an alcoholic, but I've recovered," and is told, "You will always be an alcoholic." No, you are not always an alcoholic. You have recovered. You are not an alcoholic. The identity becomes objectified through the substance in relation to the personality as a whole, when the real imbalance was simply, "I drank alcohol." That is an imbalance, but it is not an imbalance that defines the totality of who I am. So imagine this. I have an imbalance. The negative force of black magic enters and amplifies it. I feel powerless to correct it. Then I move from that impotence into resignation. I resign myself to that identity. My identity becomes objectified, and I end up in an even worse situation, because now I am not only unable to correct the imbalance, I also identify with it and say, I am fundamentally imbalanced as a person. This is why we have to be very careful at every stage. I understand that Kabbalah must operate at a preventive level, where we explain to the person that they have divine forces within them to establish a first barrier, to stop the amplification. When the imbalance is reduced to its exact measure, understood precisely where it is, without amplification, that is what we could call the first defeat of black magic. Because the first defeat of black magic is not "I have no imbalance," that would be absurd. The first defeat is cutting off its capacity to amplify. Once that amplification is cut, we can begin to work on the imbalance itself, to close it, to suture it, because Tikun has been done at that point. And once that happens, black magic can no longer act. Now, and I don't want to frighten those who are listening, when a person has a great deal of resistance and does not allow any of these forces to pass through them, it can sometimes affect the family environment. Because if the family environment is weak, it can attack the family environment in order to emotionally weaken you and then attack you again. It needs to weaken you emotionally, and if it does so by affecting a family member, then it returns once more with the full force of black magic. For that reason, it is not enough to do personal tikkun alone. It is also necessary to train all one's relationships in what we might call an indirect training of light, so that those relationships are also protected. But this always involves telling that negative force, "You will not bring me down, not even on an emotional level." I know this is very difficult because it may sound like we are talking about a very cold or detached attitude, but it is the only way. Because the first thing this type of force tries to do is, for example, to destabilize your partner or to destabilize your work, meaning it targets the areas where you feel more or less at peace and tries to take that peace away. It tries to disturb your calm externally, because it can no longer enter internally. In other words, when the inner world is strong, black magic begins to attack from the outside.
What is your opinion on the topic of, well, the Ayinhara, the evil eye, and the use of amulets such as the Hamsa? In other words, placing that force into an external object to counteract it. Does it truly protect or guide?
I'm going to answer you with another question. Ever thought, for example, you think, if this chair's here, something bad will happen, then you move the chair.
I don't remember if I did that. Maybe I did. I don't know.
Look what I'm going to tell you.
Yes, I understand.
Many people, most of us really, have a kind of symbolic intuition, and we're going to try to explain it. This intuition works like this. You're at home or somewhere else, and you think, if I leave this pen here, I need to move it, or I have to change this object's place. It's as if there's an intuitive sense that something is incorrect where it is and needs to be placed correctly somewhere else. People do this intuitively all the time. What we're doing now, through this meeting and this dialogue, is making something invisible visible, something that happens to many people but is rarely talked about. It's that feeling of, if I put the sweater here, something bad will happen. So you move the sweater and think, I can't tell this to anyone, or they'll send me to a psychiatrist. But this isn't something psychiatric. The vast majority of people do this. It hasn't been studied much, but it can be understood from a conceptual point of view. What the mind is doing intuitively is explaining to us where things need to be placed correctly, because things represent energies. That means that when you organize your home, when you organize the objects in your home, you're not just organizing objects, you're organizing energies. So when an amulet exists, the amulet itself doesn't have power. That's clear. That belongs to the realm of nonsense. What it does have is a visualization of where energy should go. What the amulet is telling you is how to direct energy. Therefore, the amulet itself doesn't say anything, it has no inherent meaning. What does have meaning is the symbolic effect it produces in terms of how it helps you focus energy. and that's what brings a sense of calm and well-being.
My mind is wandering to a possible Kabbalah and Feng Shui course.
Well, it has a lot to do with it because we are talking about the positioning of energies. In the end, Feng Shui is explaining where the energies are positioned, and what the Kabbalah explains is where the energies are positioned.
Of course.
So, when these things happen, that's why we return to the topic of black magic, in the sense that we know the sensation associated with black magic is that things are wrongly placed, out of alignment. When things are wrongly placed, it implies that we are projecting what, cosmogonically in Kabbalah, we know as Tzimtzum Aleph, the first contraction. In that first contraction, there was a great imbalance in the universe that remained below, in the world of the Klipot, and that imbalance is still operative. Therefore, when we perceive that something is out of balance, and you mentioned Ayin Hara at one point, which, when translated, means the evil eye.
Evil eye.
The Kabbalah tradition says that 90% of the people who die of the evil eye. Strong?
Yes, that's a lot.
Strong. What does it mean? That when someone gets sick, has caught a very strong envy, and has unbalanced it inside and has become ill. In other words, illness does not always arise from our own inner imbalances, but rather from the amplification of inner imbalances that come from the outside. For that reason, one must train throughout life to quickly perceive these energies, reposition them, and adjust all strategies accordingly. The first strategy, as stated in the Talmud, is not to focus on the issue, to act as if it does not exist. The second strategy, if it does exist, is to work on identifying where it can enter and through which kinds of imbalances it is able to take hold.
Where is the crack?
Exactly, that's it. It's interesting, and here I'll add another point that I find important, that we go through periods of klipotic work in each dimension. For example, you might have a 10-year period in your life during which you are working on the refinement of Yesod. Once you've finished working on that, and you've made significant progress, a challenge may then appear in Malkut. So you begin working on Malkut, and later an issue arises in Tifereh. It's as if, over certain periods of time, roughly 7 to 10 years of life, you are working on one dimension in particular. And because it is a klipa, the one with the greatest imbalance and the strongest charge, when you work through it, another one automatically emerges once it descends. At a certain point, we can say that you reach inner peace through total self-protection. It is possible to reach that state. If, at the level of neshama, you truly reach a point of near union with Ruach, you have almost complete protection. But I want to repeat this, that total protection does not mean that the environment cannot be affected. And one must be very careful, because the final attack of black magic will be directed toward Tiferet, that is, toward the emotional field.
Mario, I have to make you this question. Have you ever met anyone who has been affected by an act of black magic? Don't answer me. We'll be back in 15 seconds. Hey Mario, you're looking tan from the lights. What's going on with you?
I don't see you. Who are you?
Here, I am Nacho.
Hey, Nacho. How are you? This light is killing me. I need sunglasses.
Listen, there's another eye watching us. There are a lot of people back there. Hey, you, over there on the other side. Give it a like, subscribe, and join us. And if you want to collaborate in a more active way, here there is a QR that allows you to help us to continue and keep doing this podcast. You also have it in the link below in the comments. And on this Patreon, you'll find an online Kabbalah course in English to help transform your life and become happier. Mario, next time?
Sunglasses. Umbrella.
Yes, umbrella. We're here again, Mario. I had asked you if you had ever met anyone who had been affected by an act of black magic.
Absolutely, myself.
Oh, you've had that happen? Explain it.
Yes, of course, absolutely. Well, I can't share the details because they are very private, but I can tell you that for a certain period of time, several months that I can clearly identify, I genuinely felt it. At that time, I was still in intermediate Kabbalah training, and I was able to perceive it very clearly. That experience reached, I would say, a very high level because my sensitivity had grown in terms of perceiving energies from the other side as well. And it wasn't just that I found myself involved at a very specific moment in my life, but I also became aware of how another person could be affected. In fact, on one of my trips to Israel, a person was affected during a symbolic work we were doing, and I could almost feel a negative entity. In that sense, from the other side, I was able to feel the same sensation that this person experienced. But these are two different things. One is a negative entity that I was able to sense in another person, and another is the work that had been done on me. Something I not only detected, but eventually was also able to identify who was doing it. Interestingly, there is another element that I think is important to point out here, which we could call unconscious imbalances, so to speak, but not the Freudian unconscious. I'm referring to imbalanced, invisible energies in many people, where people appear to be good, people who genuinely are good, but who carry inner imbalances that they themselves are unable to perceive. So what happens, and I'm going to share a tradition that apparently comes from the Jews of Greece from a very ancient time, and that was also present in the Ottoman Empire, is something I inherited from my father and my grandfather. It is called pumaskara. Now let's explain what this means. What does pumaskara mean? For example, when a father tells his child how intelligent you are or how beautiful you look, he must say pumaskara. Pumaskara means that the invisible forces of my own imbalances will not affect you, because you never know when you say something like how beautiful you are to a child, whether there might be something negative present on the part of the father or the mother, not at a conscious level, because the parent loves the child, but at the level of what moves in the hidden realm. It is a way of stopping, even within oneself, hidden imbalances that one may not be aware of and that could potentially affect others. So imagine, in our case, I say to you, Nacho, I admire you, and I truly mean it. But I don't know what elements might be at play in the invisible realm, elements I am not conscious of internally, imbalances that operate beneath the surface and therefore need to be stopped, just in case. That's why the term pumaskara means up to here, like Shaddai, a boundary, like the boundary of Yesod. It is about placing a limit, stopping potential or invisible imbalances that one may carry in relation to another person. Therefore, no matter how refined a person may be, one must always be aware of the need to block imbalances in the invisible realm.
Mario, we have another podcast to continue working on.
Black magic is a subject with many edges, with a lot of depth, and we will have to deal with it at another time.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Shalom.